Welcome to New Atlas Live. I'm Brian Berletic. Joining me today is Scott from Kalibrated. He's becoming a regular on our live streams. We're going to talk about Ukraine, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about the situation between Israel and Palestine, because that is unfolding right now. Welcome, Scott. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. So I will point out to people who might not be familiar with you, and again, all of the places to find and follow your work, that will be in the video description below, and a pinned comment at the top of the comment section after the stream is over. But Scott, a lot of what you do is you scour Twitter and Telegram, and you pick all kinds of different information, and you post it mainly on your Telegram, but also on Twitter. And it helps me because there's a lot of information to sift through. You go through Ukrainian and Russian Telegram channels and everything in between. We're now in the fourth month, going to 5 months now of this Ukrainian offensive. What have you been seeing recently since the last time we had you on?
I think the most important thing that I've seen is a complete. It feels to me like a complete shift in the Russian operation in both the southern and the other axes that the Russians are now. I would say pushing in. It feels like the Russians now have the initiative. The Ukrainian counteroffensive has yielded no results. I made a post yesterday that was showing the actual penetration, the distance that Ukrainians have made it into Russian lines in any given position around the front. That would be around Rozhain on the ledge in between Zaporozhye and Donetsk, and on the southern Zaporozhye front around Robotny, and on the Bakhmut sector. And none of these, go past 10 kilometers. So over the last 4 months, the Ukrainians have lost an estimated 90,000 men. That number is not an absolute, but that is what the Russian side says. The Ukrainian side doesn't give us any numbers. So, obviously take it with a grain of salt, but that is at least an estimate. Even if they lost half that, it would still be a complete failure. They didn't achieve any of what they wanted to do. They wanted to cut the land bridge. They wanted to reach Tokmak, secure the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. None of that occurred. They didn't get anywhere near Tokmak. So all in all, I am now calling this Ukrainian counteroffensive a complete failure. And I think you can look at other aspects of what's going on around this counteroffensive and understand that that's the case. The articles that are now coming out from the West are not looking very good for Ukraine. They're talking, I've seen so far, I've been counting, we had the government change in Slovakia to a pro-Russian government. So that's a big deal. And then you have Poland issuing statements saying that they're not going to be able to continue arming Ukraine, whether that's political or a legitimate statement, is not a good sign for Ukraine either way. We now have reports coming out that Canada is also out of artillery shells, and I am going to assume that probably means that NATO is out of artillery shells to spare to Ukraine, because we also got a similar report from Britain that said a similar thing. They're out of arms to send. We've been talking about this for a long time, that you can't just continuously pump in this old surplus equipment and expect it to last forever. You can't continuously pump in artillery shells when you haven't increased production, and you're not looking to increase production until 2028 or 2025 if they rush it. You just can't keep throwing this stuff away and expect it to be there forever, right? So we're getting to our bottom of our surplus in NATO, and really it looks like the situation in Ukraine is going to become dire for Ukraine very quickly. On top of this failure that we've seen from the Ukrainians, the Russians have had some major successes in progressing their military capabilities, both through drones. FPV strikes have been up immensely. We actually don't see that many Lancet strikes anymore. Because FPVs have become so pervasive in the short range intercept, I guess I would call it, where Lancets used to operate heavily against armored vehicles. Lancets are now working at a much further range, which is another capability that has popped up as an extended Lancet range. as well as Russian ISR has become incredibly strong. Their ability to target acquisition in the rear has improved tremendously. The use of large reconnaissance drones, 80, 90 kilometers behind the front lines, has become pervasive for the Russians. This means improved glide bomb strikes, improved missile strikes. Lancets are able to find targets easier. Basically, all in all, the losses in the rear for the AFU are substantially increasing all the time. Staging is becoming more and more difficult. And really what it looks like now is the Ukrainians are on a defensive footing. The Russians have the initiative almost everywhere on the map. Even in the southern Donetsk region, we've seen the Ukrainians get pushed out of the Verbove sector a little bit, which is where they had actually crossed the line. That's where we had all the breakthrough talk come in. That has been reduced. Even their positions around south of Robotny have been reduced. So the Ukrainians are not pushing in the same way. They don't have the reserves to push in the same way. And yeah, I think that's pretty much where we're at right now.
I think I will agree with you that the offensive has completely failed. Even if they were to make a spectacular breakthrough and reach the coast of the Sea of Azov, they have depleted their military to such an extent that it really won't matter unless they somehow manage to, while they're doing this, wipe out the entire Russian military. It has been a complete categorical failure. You were just saying reaching the bottom, of NATO stocks. There's even articles like this from CNN. Western ammo stocks at bottom of the barrel as Ukraine war drags on. NATO official warns, and you pointed out how we have been talking about this for months, and we were accused of being, Russian propagandists for saying this. But in reality, we were reading deep into Western articles where all of this truth was buried at the bottom. It was there. It just wasn't prominent. They had the headlines about how the Challenger 2 is going to push aside Russian forces, but deep in the article, they're like, they're talking about how they're out of artillery. They're out of all of these stocks. And another thing, you were just talking about all of these improving and greater quantities of Russian weapons and capabilities. And there was this article I asked you right before. You said you didn't read it, but I'll just go over a couple of things and ask you what you might think about it. And this is from the Times. Alexander Mercouris pointed this out to me. I'll do this. I'll go over this in depth in my next update. Our allies ask us to advance with a gun at our backs, and this isn't Russians saying this. This is Ukrainians, and it says with progress slowing, Ukraine's troops need Western jets and missiles. They tell Maxim Tucker. And one thing before we get started, the military unit that they're talking to is called Sturmgewehr, or however you say that in German, and this is what Adolf Hitler named Nazi Germany's premier assault rifle.
And this is a Ukrainian unit.
Yes,
with a Russian name.
Or with a German, a Nazi German.
Nazi German.
Yeah, not just German, Nazi German.
Kind of like their drone division that's called the Luftwaffe for some reason. It's crazy.
So I mean, again, it is everywhere, and it's they'll say that it's Russian propaganda, but that's the Times that reported that. So in that article, they're talking about Fab 500, and there's a whole variety of Fab bombs now. Smaller ones that go further, much bigger ones that do more damage, and they were talking about how this has become a huge problem for them, and it's a problem that is growing. So again, just as you said, and they talk about how we need F-16s and ATACMS that will solve this problem. And especially the ATACMS, how does that solve Su-34 bombers dropping glide bombs? I don't understand. But
I do wonder if behind the scenes, if the Ukrainians are asking for other things, but publicly they're asking for these distraction sort of weapons, because the ATACMS is this thing that will take focus away from the failing counteroffensive. It'll create opportunities in the rear for publicity, right? You strike something like the Black Sea Fleet headquarters, like we recently saw gets hit, and that is like a big publicity stunt that distracts everybody. It doesn't do anything. There was nobody even in the building, But do you think that they're asking, because I know what the Ukrainians need are radars and short-range air defense. That's what they need more than anything else. But they don't seem to really be asking for that. Do you think they're asking for that stuff behind closed doors?
I don't know if they are or if they aren't, but what short range air defense does NATO have to transfer to Ukraine
Exactly.
in the quantities that they needed? And they were getting the Avenger, and they always talk about the Avenger. They never really mention that it's just basically a Stinger mounted on a Hummer. So that is a huge problem. Now, another thing that you do is you engage with, or I should say, you post stuff, and then the pro-Ukrainian crowd comes to you.
Yeah,
especially on Twitter.
Yeah.
And what are you getting the sense of these people, both in government statements that you have been seeing in the news and just ordinary people online? What sense are you getting in regards to how they see this? Do they still think the offensive is going to somehow work out in their favor? What have you been seeing and reading?
Yeah, so I think that there are categories, obviously, of people on the internet that everybody kind of fits into one of these categories. You have the pro-Russians, right, who have always been bullish about Russia's situation. Then you have the pro-Russians who are very pessimistic always about Russian situations. Then you have the military analysts, like I would consider yourself, and even some of the pro-Ukrainian, but the really honest, hardworking analysts, they're in the middle. And then you have the pro-Ukrainians who are realistic, and then you have the pro-Ukrainians who are delusional, right? So it's kind of like a spectrum. In the pro-Ukrainians that are realistic, and usually this is the actual people that are Ukrainian, the people that are on the ground. You have people like I can never say his name. It's Illy something Paparenko or something like that. Do you know who I'm talking about?
I think I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, I can never say his name, and I don't think I've ever actually read it, but he is one of the steadfast pro-Ukrainian supporters, and his morale seems like it's at an all-time low. Anybody who's realistic, it really seems like they're starting to understand the reality and gravity of the situation, that Ukraine is not going to win. They can see the Western support beginning to die off. And yeah, the articles coming out have just been atrocious for anybody who's a pro-Ukrainian supporter, right? Like a hardcore pro-Ukrainian supporter. And in the delusional space, it's even starting to touch that. So the people that are, never say never about Ukraine, they're beginning to feel it, and it's starting to slip. I think that I talked about this, and I believe you talked about it. The end of this counteroffensive is what is going to be the end of this delusion that Ukraine is going to be able to win. I think that everybody thought that this was going to go different. I think that everybody thought that the Western support was going to be endless and infinite, and it's not possible, and it's not in the U.S. interest to keep doing that, right? As soon as Ukraine becomes more of a cost than a benefit, they'll just drop it like they've done with every other proxy. And that's what we're beginning to see now. And it really does feel coordinated. We're getting these simultaneous articles coming out from all over the Western world about how they're running out of weapons, how the situation is dire, and either they're preparing their audience for a Ukrainian defeat and a U.S. back off and a Western back off from their support, or the situation is really that bad and they're trying to either drum up support through these kind of fear articles, or they just are writing articles and genuinely they don't have any weapons left. No matter how you put it, it's bad news for Ukraine. So in the information space, yeah, things are starting to get, iffy. You're starting to see people like Paul Mazzaro, like, why aren't we giving ATACMS and Taurus missiles to Ukraine? He's been saying ATACMS every day since the war began, but he is now even starting to say, like, when did it become, we'll help Ukraine negotiate, not help Ukraine to victory, like that, those sort of things. You're really starting to see a lot of that talk, and it's just going to get worse and worse and worse as this continues into winter, I believe.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting point. There's a couple of other extremely pro-Ukrainian commentators, I will call them, especially on Twitter. And these are people that no matter how bad things were going, they would still find some way to spin it, even if they had to just make something up. And I mean, completely fabricate something. Even those people are starting to say, they're cursing the White House. They're saying that the bottleneck is the White House, and all they have to do is it's delusional, because that's not the bottleneck. The bottleneck is the arms and ammunition. The West has not prepared for a conflict like this, and it takes years and years to prepare for a conflict like this. And it's not something that you can just pivot on a dime and transform your industry to suddenly adapt to this. It just cannot be done. It is impossible. So I'm not sure. I think even after the offensive failing, because a lot of people are saying it's just going to continue on to the winter and into the next spring. What do you think about people saying that?
I mean, these are the people waiting for the Steiner offensive, right? Has he gone on his offensive yet? Is Berlin secure? And that's like, that these people will never stop believing until the very end, right? There are those people that are definitely going to be like that. And in terms of the counteroffensive, I've been answering these comments. People have been saying this to me nonstop on Twitter. Oh, well, the offensive isn't over. Why are you saying it's over? It's just going to continue into the winter. I don't think people really understand how wars work in general, let alone how initiative works in combat. You have to build up a fighting force. If you're constantly being attrited on the battlefield, you can't just continue an offensive forever. And if you do, it's going to be the most insignificant offensive you've ever seen, with these little mosquito tactics where you're still claiming you're on the offensive, but you're not achieving anything. Basically what I would say we've been seeing for the last month and a half, right? The Ukrainians haven't achieved anything in the last month. In terms of territory, it's been maybe 100 meters around Kleshchivka from time to time, 100 meters around Verbove in the south, possibly. But even then, that's coming at such extreme high losses that it's not beneficial for Ukraine at all to continue doing this. But if they want to continue, they can. And I don't think the Russians are going to be that upset about that, because keep throwing your men in these small, insignificant numbers, but significant enough to be, counting losses from these actions at our defense fortifications. Well, why would we care about that? But at this point, I would say that I do believe that the offensive operations are now done. That the Ukrainians just can't stage anymore. We see logistics are being hit, trains are being hit. It's really starting to. I've been waiting for this for a while now. I've talked to some people who I trust in the information space, and they've been talking about how there are massive orders for Russian reconnaissance and strike drones, which we're going to be seeing soon on the battlefield. We have seen a massive increase in Russian ISR and their deep reconnaissance drones, and I'm pretty sure that's just making any staging for the Ukrainian army impossible at this point. So I don't think we're going to see any more significant movements from the Ukrainians, and the Russians are now applying pressure on multiple areas of the front. I don't think we're going to see big moves from the Russians either. I think that Ukrainian firepower is still too significant in terms of their artillery and deep strike capabilities to actually, concentrate force in any significant number to cause a massive breakthrough and, a large aero offensive sort of thing. But I do think we're going to see pressure all over the map and really, really start pulling the Ukrainian army in multiple different directions. And then eventually something's going to break. A dam will bust somewhere. And then when they go to respond to that dam breaking, another dam's going to break somewhere else. I think the areas to watch are obviously the south. I think they're going to try to reverse most of the gains of the Ukrainian army in the south. And then around Avdiivka, possibly the Seversk front, even though that area is difficult for the Russians, I believe. I think this is one of the most easily defended areas by the Ukrainians. I don't know if the commander in that area is just very proficient or what it is, if the Russians just don't push very hard here. But this area is very strong. And then up in the north, the Kharkov area, the Kupiansk area, where the Russians are actively pushing.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. That's something that I've been saying. It's just the nature of modern combat. These big arrow offensives, when you have an opponent that has possession of modern weaponry and knows how to use it, it just makes it very implausible or extremely costly. If it is successful, extremely costly. So maybe Russia has the numbers and the type of weapons needed to do a big arrow offensive, but it would be tremendously costly, which I think they want to avoid. So I think it will be pressure all along the line of contact. And we've actually seen that where they have pressure all along the line of contact, and something gives and they take advantage of that, and they make pretty significant gains, but not in the way people imagine, but in a very incremental way over the course of maybe 1 or 2 months. Yeah. What do you make of these claims that Ukrainian forces are gathering on the other side of the Dnieper River around Kherson, and they're going to do an amphibious landing? What do you make of that?
Okay, so you've already expended a vast majority of your well-prepared reserves. You've been heavily attrited, and now you're going to line up for a Normandy-style crossing, and it's hard for me to wrap my head around. Maybe if they go for the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, that could be a possibility. But the issue is the Russians are heavily concentrated in this area. They have the fire support. They have the aviation support. There's just no, I don't see the point in it. Once again, I don't think the Russians would be too upset with the Ukrainians coming across on boats or, crossing the reservoir, because that's just a big open space that they're going to be able to pick these advancing units off in. I don't particularly see it happening. I think it's just way too risky. You're just going to lose so many men doing that. You can't push through the defenses up north. Why do you think you're going to be able to do it with supplying a bridgehead? There's a reason why the Russians crossed over the Dnieper and left Kherson last year. There's a reason why they did it, and that's because keeping a bridgehead supplied when you don't have secure supply lines is incredibly difficult and risky. You can lose a whole army doing that. So the Russians pulled back. I don't see the Ukrainians crossing. That would be insanity. I could see an operation potentially for the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. I think that is a very real possibility. They might try to secure that and then move into some form of negotiations. I think that would probably, at this point, be their most advantageous option to secure better bargaining chips at the table. But I don't see that even being successful. I think that the Russians are now overly established in this area. And I don't see it working out. So,
and something people should keep in mind, there are layered defenses between Kherson and Crimea that no one has been talking about, but were included in that New York Times article last year. Now, what do you think about this possibility? And this is just speculation on my part. They're staging these forces. A lot of them are these broken brigades that were participating in the offensive. Maybe they're going to try to cross the Dnieper and draw off some of Russia's long-range precision weapons like glide bombs, draw them off into that direction so that they could give another try for their main axis of offense, Robotyno, Verbove. What do you think about that?
Well, I just had one last thing to say about the Kherson crossing, just real quick, and I wanted to make this very clear. If the Ukrainians decide to continue the offensive into the winter, something is going to break somewhere. We've already seen the Russians force rotation up into the Kupiansk area, and there are Bradleys up there now being destroyed. So I in the south, I think that area is gone. Could you repeat your question real quick for me, just so I can make sure that
I saw you. Maybe you had some early morning, because people have to remember, Scott, it's super early. He just got.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's
some stuff to take.
What time is it? 5:30.
Yeah. So I asked, maybe they're going to try this crossing, knowing that it's really not going to succeed, but it could draw off some of Russia's long-range precision weaponry, the glide bombs, for example, Iskander, in that direction, so that they could give another try toward Robotyno or Verbove, something like that.
It's possible. Anything's possible. I don't have a detailed intelligence map of where Ukrainian positions are, where their force concentration is right now. If they had a large force north of Robotny and a large force over in Kherson, that's a possibility. But like I said previously, and this is the part I was thinking about something while you were talking, and then I kind of lost what you said. But with that force rotation to Avdiivka, to Seversk, to Kupiansk, I just don't think that they have the force now to push in the south at all. I think that anything that you see across the Dnieper or in the south towards Robotny will now be a distraction to try to keep Russian forces in a place, the same way that the Russians tried to keep Ukrainian forces up in the north while the offensive in the south was going on or around Bakhmut or around any area where the Russians were pushing. That's what the Ukrainians are now doing. I think the Ukrainians are now on a defensive footing, and they're going to try to rebuild this army again. And I don't see that happening either. I really do think that the Ukrainians have been severely attrited in the south. I think that some serious damage has been done to a lot of these brigades. And while, you might count these brigades as being up and operational just because their icons are on the map, I don't think that any of these brigades have any significant combat capabilities anymore. So I really don't see anything happening in the south. We've seen it fail when it was at its strongest, and the Russians have only gotten stronger from the position that they were in June. And the Ukrainians have only gotten weaker. So I don't see that happening.
Yes, and to back up what you're saying, I was just looking at liveuamap.com. This is the pro-Ukrainian map that I always reference, and I reference it specifically to show people even the pro-Ukrainian side is saying this is what's happening on the battlefield. And I was just checking all the axes of offense that Ukraine is supposedly conducting, and they're doing exactly what you say. They look like they're on the defensive. You see the red Russian rifle icons in places like Robotino, Verbove, north and northeast of these places. It looks like they're being pushed back, or Russia is at least retaking some of the security zone so that Ukraine has to go through it all over again. And this is the way the defenses were designed to work. They're working precisely as designed, and we still hear progress. Ukraine is making progress. I don't think that they are. Now, this question on the screen coincides with another one that I saw, but I lost it. It was talking about Russian President Vladimir Putin talking about how Odessa, among other cities, is a Russian city, and people
little Jewish.
Yes, well, interpreted as eventually Russia is going to take Odessa, which is one way of interpreting it. And as Alexander Mikiros was pointing out in his recent video, he was saying it's also possible that there could be a legitimate negotiation process that creates a government in Kiev that will be a real buffer between Russia and NATO, and they will give assurances to the Russian-speaking people of what's left of Ukraine, including Odessa. So between that and this question, will Russia go all the way into West Ukraine to get the Nazis, essentially? What do you think about all of that?
So I've kind of had the same stance most of the conflict. I think that the Russians will most definitely secure everything east of the Dnieper River. I think that is probably a very solid guarantee at this point. If some settled negotiation isn't brought up, I think that the only thing that would maybe change this is a intentional Western regime change in Ukraine that forces negotiations, and the Russians get a really, really, really good deal out of it. And that would be, the things that they went in for, obviously protection of the Russian language, recognition of Crimea and all of the annexed territories that are now Russia, obviously securing water to Crimea, and NATO neutrality. Probably that country may be able to join the EU. I don't think Russia really cares about that so much, but the NATO neutrality is a big thing. So there is that possibility, which, I think is the best case scenario for the West right now. I think that that's kind of what they're hoping for, is some sort of ceasefire, even if that doesn't, translate into, permanent peace. I don't think the West cares about that at all. I think that they want time to let their military industrial complex come online a little bit more, maybe be able to extend this conflict out in the future, rearm Ukraine, get them back set up, just so that at least they're a potent enough force that they're a deterrent to Russia in the future. Maybe not capable of actually doing any damage to Russia, but just being, a tripwire for the West. On the other end, the way I see the conflict ending is that the Russians start pushing. Eventually, the Ukrainians break somewhere, and when the Ukrainians break somewhere, it's going to be a cascade. They're going to break in one place, they're going to break in another place after they rotate to try to stop the breakthrough, and then slowly the whole thing is going to start collapsing. And I've been saying for a long time, I think that this will end when Kiev is captured. And I don't think that is going to be some bloody fighting Berlin style in the streets of Kiev. I think that Kiev will be captured in a more peaceful way with the capitulation of the government. I think they're going to probably leave into exile. What happens after that, how much territory Russia keeps, I'm not sure. But I'm almost positive that the western part of Ukraine, where these Banderites or whatever you would like to call them are, will probably go to Poland and Hungary, and the different ethnic groups will return to their appropriate countries and the traditional historical lands. That solves a lot of problems for Russia, I believe. You don't have to do some 2-3 year long operation in Western Ukraine to weed out all of these individuals. I don't know if it would take that long. Honestly, this is just me guessing, so take it with a huge grain of salt. How it ends is not set. I could definitely see a buffer state being placed there, but I don't think the western part of Ukraine is ever really an idea. The only reason that the western part of Ukraine would ever be Russian is if a complete collapse happens, the West doesn't go in for some reason, doesn't try to secure some side of it. Poland doesn't go in and try to do anything, whatever. They just leave it alone. The Russians just move in there casually. I think that could potentially be a situation where that happens. Or if the West never backs down, the West keeps escalating, keeps going, and the Russians say, that's it, enough's enough. We have to go to basically the Carpathians. We're going to just finish this once and for all so this can never happen again. That would be one of the cases. I see that being one of the least likely situations to unfold. Realistically, I think that, everything east of the Dnieper River and potentially Odessa. I think that a landlocked Ukraine would be the best outcome for the Russians. I think that that's what they probably wanted from the beginning. And that's how I see that working out.
What do you think about this possibility? And this is just something I'm honestly wondering about myself. There is some sort of regime change in Kiev. Government that Russia sees in favorable light comes to power, and they start building a relationship with it in a similar manner that they have with Belarus as it exists today. And I see that unfolding in a way that would make it okay for Russia that Kherson City, Odessa remains part of this Ukraine that is created. And they'll also be able to root out the Nazis in Western Ukraine. And, whether those parts went to Poland or Hungary or Romania or whatever is besides the point. I think they would be able to root it out. And of course, the US would invest heavily in trying to overthrow that government again, just like they did in 2014 and before that tried in 2004. But I think Russia and Belarus, they've realized and understood this problem. They have found a way to solve this problem. They will not allow that to happen to Ukraine yet a third time. So what do you think about that? Is that plausible? Is there anything that I'm probably missing some
that
obvious
would be
thing?
that would be the Union State ending, right? That
Yes.
would be one of the most beneficial for Russia. That's one where they maintain the territorial integrity, as much as they can of Ukraine. They give as much of Ukraine back as they can after whatever they take, or whatever they capture. And then Ukraine is not a landlocked country that is, completely economically devastated and just a black hole basically in Europe, but rather it still has access to the Black Sea. It has close relations with Russia. So economically, it's getting cheap energy. It's getting all of the commodities that it needs. It can actually prosper as a country while being supported by Russia. And, I think that is probably the most beneficial ending. I do not think the West can allow that to happen. But if, Russian internal security gets into Kiev ever, and that actually happens, then there's nothing that the West could possibly do to overturn that. It's not going to happen in Belarus. It won't be happening in that style of Ukraine. That would be the biggest victory that I think that the Russians could achieve, would be getting basically Ukraine to become a Belarus. And I think that would probably be the best ending for Ukraine as well, at least the Ukrainian people. But I just don't think the West can let that happen. They are so overly invested in this. That would be the worst possible scenario. That would be a complete Russian victory in my eyes. That would be more of a Russian victory than the Russians pushing to the Carpathians and capturing all of Ukraine. Because in that scenario, there's such an easy path for the Russians back in the international stage. They say, look, we settled this. Ukraine is now Ukraine still. They still have access to the Black Sea. The grain is coming out of Ukraine, going to the world. Ukrainians can still be Ukrainians. They're just not tied to the West anymore. They're tied to us. And that would be a complete defeat for the West.
You said something that, and I agree with this 100%, by the way, that would be the best possible outcome for the Ukrainian people. Yeah. And I know a lot of people rooting for NATO and the Ukrainian proxies will completely disagree with you on that. But I just want to point out that we have people in the US Congress saying, we're going to fight to the last Ukrainian. They're going to fight Russia so we can deter China. This is a great investment. We're killing Russians and we're not losing a single American, at least not officially. So what does that tell you about the actual nature of this conflict and the true nature of Western support for Ukraine? How can anyone in good faith argue that making this continue the way it is, actually that is in the best interests of the Ukrainian people, versus an outcome where Ukraine gets to exist, because Russia is not going to allow a NATOized Ukraine. They're not going to. And again, people will say, well, we have to make them. And then again, just flip the script and pretend Russia was in Canada doing this to the US. How would Americans feel? So it just, on so many levels and in so many very easy to see ways, everything about this is the way it's being presented by the West is wrong. And you even have, what do you think about, you're an American, you live in America. What do you think when you hear people in US Congress saying this about Ukraine? And then you see people in the streets even, or online, absolutely convinced that this war has to continue for the best interest of the Ukrainian people.
Yeah. So, as a normal American, I can tell you that almost no normal Americans even understand that this war is still going on. It is so just that, it's just a faraway place. It's like Korea. Like there's the Korean War was going on. Americans kind of knew about it, but they didn't really understand the scope or scale of what was happening. That's what Ukraine is for normal Americans. So I think that one thing that a lot of people who actually follow this very closely need to understand is you are talking to a small subsection of the world that really enjoys following military conflicts and geopolitics. And that's the audience that you're constantly talking to. So it makes it seem constantly like this is a major topic on everybody's mind. The only time people talk about Ukraine is when the government gives a bunch of money to them, and people don't like that because why isn't that money going to them, basically? So that's the first thing. And I think that's why this has really gone on for so long, is because normal Americans don't have the time to think or care about this. And that's very unfortunate. As an American following this very closely, I'm bitter. I am so unbelievably unhappy. I've stopped following US politics at this point because it just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat, Republican, at that level in Congress and in the House, these people are just warmongers. The only reason they got there is because they followed the rules and they listened to the right people. And those are their lobbyists and their supporters, right? Their backers, the people who are paying for their campaigns and everything, and who are going to give them jobs at Raytheon and Boeing and, once they're done. Isn't Mark Milley already working somewhere?
I haven't checked on him, but I wouldn't be surprised.
I think he already got a job somewhere.
Austin.
And this is part of the thing, is like all of this legislation that's being passed, all of these ideas, all of the intelligence that is being brought to the decision makers, saying that Ukraine can win, that we can do this forever, that the Russians are weak, that the Russians are insignificant. All of this bullshit that has been brought forward is used to achieve success after their careers, or continue their careers through their lobbying. So I'm personally very bitter about it. And I think that, me and you were both called Russian propagandists, Putin apologists, all of this stuff. And time after time after time, 6 months after we say these things, we continue to be proven correct. Always. We were right about the ammo. We were right about Western support. We were right about the Ukrainian counteroffensive and Ukrainian capabilities. We were right about what the Russians were going to do, how they were going to increase their military industrial complex, how they were going to really come online, how they were going to be stronger after the end of this. We said these things, and people continue to say that we're just like liars and we're, shills and all of this nonsense. But again, what did we say? The West did not care about Ukraine. The West has never cared about Ukraine. They do not give a shit. They didn't care, in 2000, they didn't care about Ukraine. The only reason they care about Ukraine is because Ukraine is a tool that can be used against a perceived adversary in Russia. And really, that's all it ever was. You have Lindsey Graham, a year ago, or was it a year ago, talking about this is the best money we ever spent killing Russians.
I think he says it like 3 times a day, actually.
Yeah, that's his mantra. He wakes up and he looks himself in the mirror like that and then says it over and over and over again. Dead Russians, dead Russians, dead Russians. That's like that is what they're doing. That's what a proxy is. And I don't understand how people cannot see through this. You're being emotionally manipulated, and by this virtue signaling nonsense. This is not about democracy. This is not about freedom. This is about beating the Russians. That's what this is about. And really what it's about is about beating the Chinese eventually.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That's what this is all about. The whole, we need to take down Russia. We need to separate Russia and China. And then once Russia's neutralized, we'll focus on China. That's what this whole thing is about. And it's just not working. And now you're going to see the repercussions of this idea that Ukraine is a tool. They don't care about the population. They've sent thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands potentially to their deaths. Recently to their deaths. Definitely hundreds of thousands have been sent to their deaths over this entire conflict. And the West doesn't care. We'll put up flags in our front yard. We'll pretend. We'll keep sending money to keep the death moving, but we don't give a shit about Ukraine. The U.S. government does not care. Why would they? What historical connection does the U.S. have with Ukraine? None. Do we have a massive Slavic population in the United States? No. We just do not have any connection to this place. And people talk about how Russia is this evil monster, encroaching on Ukraine. There are Russians in Ukraine. There is a historical connection. They share a border. They share a common language. They share a culture. Even their church is basically the same. It's this. This is like the saddest part about this conflict is it's just Slavs killing Slavs, and they're doing it at the behest of the West. Honestly, it's the best thing the U.S. could have asked for, but if the Ukrainians would have won and the Russian economy would have collapsed, right? Now Russia is this monster in the East. They're this huge military that's poised in a westward direction now, which is exactly the opposite of what this whole project was intended to, equate to. But yeah, I don't see. I've never seen any compassion or love for the Ukrainian people. The only side I've ever seen actually do that was the Russians, which is hard to say because, you see civilians getting killed in Ukraine, and that's horrible, right? This is a horrible thing. But this talk of genocide and this talk of, this Russian hatred towards the Ukrainians, I've never seen it. The people that the Russians hate are the people who hate the Russians. And those are the Nazis in the West. I mean, the Nazis in Ukraine, I guess they're not just in the West, they're all over. And the Western people in Ukraine, the Western backers of Ukraine, who have never cared for Ukraine ever. They just want to use it.
Yeah. I think that's all very, very valid points. I agree with that. They're doing the exact same thing about Taiwan. They couldn't care less about Taiwan. Yeah. And in their think tank documents, and again, people should look into this because ordinary people, like you say, they're not even aware of any of these things. They think they'll confuse Taiwan with Thailand. I'm in Thailand. I've had many people say, "Hey, Brian, how are things going in Taiwan?" I don't know. And that would be Chinese people killing Chinese people. So again, many similar dynamics here. And in their think tank documents, they even say everything's going to be destroyed on this island. Their infrastructure, their industry, everything is going to be demolished. But we see it as a way of advancing our interests. They don't say at Taiwan's cost, but that's what they're basically saying. And we've talked about think tank papers years before this all happened in Ukraine, saying basically the same thing. And another U.S. proxy, although a lot of people will probably disagree with me, is Israel. Israel's another country that I don't think the West actually cares about. You have to pretend that you care about it, but in reality, if you actually did care about it, I think you would be doing what Russia and China do with their relationship with Israel, try to direct them into a more sensible direction. But right now, the West encourages and enables Israel to go down the most self-destructive path imaginable. Yeah. So maybe there's some news coming out, and I saw you posting some of this unfolding conflict on your Telegram channel. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what's going on there. I mean, it's unfolding right now, so it's very hard to...
Yeah, it's super fresh. So if I make mistakes, I'm not a Palestine and Israel expert. I am not going to claim this. I follow the conflicts a little bit from a distance. But yeah, I did post about it. We had some attacks by Hamas against the IDF forces. And this was a very large coordinated attack. It was significant. They raided, I think, one I wouldn't call it an outpost, one defensible position of the IDF and captured some soldiers. They destroyed one. How do you pronounce the tank? Is it Makivka?
I think it's Merkava.
Merkava tank with a drone. So once again, multi-million-dollar tanks being destroyed by basically a mortar round attached to a DIY drone. And then, we also saw a massive incursion by Hamas. And they were using things like paragliders, which was very interesting. These pictures of, guys on little paragliders flying into I don't know if it was into Israel. I've actually not seen a map of where these attacks happened. I woke up, an hour ago and just started posting about it because I saw it. But now you have Netanyahu talking about going to war with Hamas. So this is a significant occurrence and a big event for the region, and I'm going to follow it very closely. But if we remember what happened in 2006 when the Israelis went into Lebanon, they got kind of their asses handed to them by a force that is very difficult to fight against. The U.S. knows all about that. Maybe they believe now with their technological advances, with their drone capabilities, that sort of stuff, they're going to be able to actually fight this conflict better. But any incursion into Palestine or Lebanon is going to have consequences for Israel. And I just don't, I think the whole region is moving in the wrong direction.
Yes, and I would just like to add, about 2006, that was Israel fighting Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. But Israel ended up bombing all of Lebanon across the entire country. Huge damage. They were trying to win this war with an air campaign, which you cannot do. You have to go in on the ground. When they went in on the ground, they found that Hezbollah was well-trained, well-led, well-equipped. They had modern anti-tank weapons. They were destroying Merkava tanks back then. And Israel basically withdrew. They landed some troops near the Litani River to claim, hey, we reached our objective, and then they pulled out. And they have not really seemed to be interested in a conflict with Hezbollah again. And yes, they are trying to improve their military edge, but I don't think that that's possible now in modern times. I think there is parity between these forces, and the idea of Israel continuing its current posture politically, geopolitically, militarily through military force, that age is over. And now they're fighting with Palestinians. There was another, not too long ago, there was another exchange of violence, and it really wasn't going well for Israel. There's all of these rockets that the Palestinians are launching at Israel, overwhelming their air defense system. So that is a problem. That looks like that's taking place here again. I just want to remind people, though, because I always see people in the comment section, Israel runs the world, Israel runs America. It's like, how does a country with that sized military and GDP running the rest of the world? Yes, they have lobbyists in the U.S., no doubt, but so did Saudi Arabia. So does South Korea. So do all of these countries. That's how imperialism works, as a court, and they're represented there in modern times by lobbyists. So there's that. There's also the fact, and I don't know if you agree with me on this or not, but I see this as a huge strategy of tension that first the British and now the Americans maintain deliberately. They encourage Israel to do the most provocative, inhumane things possible to provoke equal and extreme but opposite reactions from the Palestinians, and they keep this whole cycle going, and it just justifies America's involvement in the Middle East. They'll never try to solve this on their own, just like they were doing with Saudi Arabia and Iran, until Russia and China disrupted that and began the process. And I've always said that eventually that will happen with Israel, probably a lot sooner than people think. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that this is a pretty common situation that the U.S. creates all over the world, right? They're doing it in Taiwan. They did it in Ukraine. They've done it in Israel. They're going to do it everywhere that they possibly can. They're going to use these little proxies anywhere that they can to cause chaos. I've always said that the U.S., when the U.S. is in doubt, they cause chaos, and then they look to benefit from it. They look for some opportunity in that chaos. They've always done this, and it works, right? But it's a very risky and event-filled choice to go about your foreign policy in this way. So when it comes to Israel, yes, I do believe, well, first off, I think that there's bad blood here for the last 100 years, and before that, thousands of years. So, this is not something new. This is a hard area to create peace in. I mean, peace in the Middle East is a pipe dream for most. But yeah, I do believe that they encourage these provocative actions, because then you say, well, look at what the Palestinians are doing. They're attacking us. We're just little Israel here. We're just trying to do our own little thing. Meanwhile, You're pushing people out of their homes. Soon Palestine probably won't exist. At least the outer portions, the West Bank, will probably still be around, but the more rural areas, I guess I would call it, of Israel are slowly just disappearing, or Palestine are slowly disappearing to Israeli, expansion. And I'm not a, free Palestine, pro-Palestine individual. I'm completely unrelated to this conflict, and I don't have any connection to it. So from my perspective, I just step back and I look at how both sides operate and how these things go around. And I've said this for a long time, and this goes for Ukraine, this goes for Taiwan, this goes for Israel. The second the U.S. leaves, I think that the situation becomes better for all of these people. And I don't want people to get the impression that I'm like, the U.S. is just bad. They just need to leave. They need to get out. What I'm saying is that the way that the U.S. is currently operating, current U.S. foreign policy is just atrocious. It doesn't serve any of the countries that the U.S. is using, and it barely serves U.S. interests. What it really is doing is just isolating the U.S. and, making the U.S. look like a monster on this world stage, right? So from an American standpoint, what I hope is that U.S. foreign policy changes and that the U.S. can be in these places and actually be doing good things in these places and acting pragmatically for the interests of these people. And that's just not what's happening. So, yeah, I completely agree that the U.S. encourages this sort of aggressive behavior from Israel. I believe that they encourage it from Ukraine as well. I believe that all of these strikes you're seeing are coordinated by MI6 and Washington. I think that they are both heavily involved. I think that they are looking for return escalation because, just like in Palestine, if the Russians or the Palestinians respond, it's fuel, right? It's a tool that you can use. It's a weapon that you can use again. So I do believe that is the case. Yes.
Yeah, and I see people in the comment section talking about AIPAC. Yes, that it's a huge lobbying organization and it does have influence, but they don't run America. Do people honestly believe that the U.S. wouldn't be interested in waging war in the Middle East? They're just interested in war in South America, Africa, Eastern Europe.
Who established Israel? Who has financed Israel? Who saved Israel when Israel was getting pushed into the sea? This is not. There is the conspiracy. If you want, whatever you want to call it, I don't get paid by anybody, so I'm just here talking of my own free will. Israel does not run things in the United States. There are massive groups in the United States that want Israel to keep going, so it might put off the appearance that Israel has some sort of power. But really what I believe it is you have the religious groups in the United States who have an idea about Israel, tends to be Republicans. They have an idea about what Israel means to them and what Israel means in terms of their religion, which is it is a significant thing. And then there's also the people who are making a lot of money off of Israel. You see all the money that gets pumped into there every year. How much of our annual budget goes to Israel?
It's billions. Yeah, it's billions of dollars.
Yeah. And it's every year. So if you don't think that there are defense contractors making money off of that, civilian contractors making money off of that, that's just a complete joke. There are people making millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars off of Israel. So that's going to keep going, just like Ukraine is going to keep going. As long as there's money to be made somewhere, the U.S. is going to pursue that. I don't think that Israel has a massive political pull in, like, it's not Israel controlling U.S. politics. It's U.S. politics being hyper interested in Israel.
Yeah, the West, the U.S. and before that, the British Empire were interested in conquering the Middle East.
Yeah,
always. This was always their dream, and they're busy everywhere else too, doing the exact same thing but with different proxies. So I just wish people could put all of that together. So that's one thing, because the problem is you have people who are irrationally extreme on both sides. People in Israel want to exterminate the Arab world. You have people on the other side that want to push Israel into the ocean. And in reality, people have to look at the middle ground. And regarding Hamas, even it's much more complicated. Yes, people in Palestine have the right to defend themselves without doubt, and there are people in Palestine who do that. There are people in Hamas who do that. But just remember, Hamas, or at least factions of Hamas, joined the U.S.-led proxy war against Syria, against Iran, against Russia. Just keep that in mind. And there were Arab U.S. allies who support Hamas. Iran supports certain factions, but it's a much different organization than, say, Hezbollah in Lebanon. So it's complicated, and we have to actually analyze it, and we have to avoid, just like you say, Scott, don't get heavily invested in it. If you're an analyst, don't get heavily invested in it. Yes, I believe people have the right to defend themselves, so I would never disagree with that. But we have to rule out emotions, because emotions are always going to send you off a cliff, and you will always draw the wrong conclusions when you allow emotions rather than reason and analysis to guide how you're sorting this out. And I honestly believe that eventually the U.S. position in the Middle East will weaken even more, and people in Israel are going to have to either choose to continue down this irrational path of self-destruction. It is off over a cliff. Their current policy is leading them off a cliff, or they're going to have to do what Saudi Arabia and Iran did, and they will begin sorting things out and trying to build a country that actually is invested in self-preservation, which means treating your neighbors with respect, humanity, dignity, cooperating with them instead of trying to kill them. Scott, you have anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, just that. Well, one thing with the hyper-emotional response, I think that this is what you see a whole lot from the pro-Ukrainian side. And this is the same. I don't follow, like I said, Israeli and Palestinian information space all that much. I have some, sources that I follow that cover the topic, but in terms of like actually communicating with people on the topic, I don't do that very often. But we see this all the time where you ignore the thing that's sitting right in front of your face, the obvious truth that's right in front of you, the mathematical truth that's right in front of you. And I think that that's why we were correct about some of these things, is because we just set all of that aside. We might have a bias that we want one side to win or not. I don't think we've even ever talked about that, because we don't really need to. What we talk about is the reality, because what we want to happen, it doesn't matter, right? It's what's going to happen. That's what matters. And I think that that's what you're running into a lot with at least the pro-Ukrainian information space, is that these people, and you see it sometime on the pro-Russian, the two ends of the spectrum, really, where these people will ignore the facts and the reality sitting right in front of them for the idea that they want to be true. And then with regards to Israel and Palestine, I think that one thing that the U.S. has done very well in both Ukraine and Palestine is propagandize. I think that the governments of these countries have also done this very well. So even if the U.S. leaves Israel, I honestly don't know how that whole area goes back to normal ever, or goes back to any sort of relative peace, because the population there now is like riled up, just like the Ukrainian population was riled up, right? They've been told the same thing for 10, 15, 20 years. It's in their heads. A whole generation has been raised on that idea. And that is, it's almost impossible to root out without some sort of conflict. So I don't know if we'll ever see peace in the Middle East until, Palestine is gone, or Israel is gone, or, or there's fundamental changes in Israeli policy, which I think will be very difficult to convince the population of.
Yeah, and I'm looking in the comments and I see people, you could see who is completely emotionally invested in this, and not being rational. I don't think Scott is condoning anything that Israel does. I think we've just both We've just both said that Israel does things that are appalling.
No, and I am
inhumane.
I am not pro-Israel by any stretch of the imagination. I know that Israel bombs, Palestine and kills kids every day. I've seen
Bulldozes people's homes.
I've seen it, and this is going to piss people off, and I don't care. But I've also seen Hamas, or not Hamas, but Hamas in Palestine have kids around military equipment, which is also not okay. So I just like to step back and look at all of this in a very callous and non-biased way, because
realist.
And for me, I mean, I have absolutely no investment in this region. I have anti-investment in U.S. foreign policy in the region. So, I mean, I'm not pro-Israel by any stretch of the imagination. I just like to step back and look at it. And it's also such an emotional area. I mean, way, way more so than Ukraine. This is there's a religious aspect. There is this is people's whole lives, right? And I don't mean like the people living in Israel. I mean the people who are invested in Israel. And it's just or Palestine. And for me, it's just I don't want to even have that conversation.
I just, I think I already said this, but I'm just going to repeat it. Look at Russia and look at China. So I think much of my audience and I agree with Russian and Chinese foreign policy. I agree with multipolarism. I in a way promote it because I try to explain what is really happening objectively and explain what the difference is between what the U.S. has been doing for decades and what is trying to emerge and displace that. And look at China, look at Russia. They both have a relationship with Israel in certain aspects, very close relations in all sorts of areas. So ask yourself, why is that? Is it because Russia and China are evil, or is it because they also understand that given time, given the right circumstances, you remove the actual problem from the region that is spurring all of this division and violence? The United States, their influence, imperialism, if you want to reduce it to that. Remove that, and you will be able to, not the politicians running Israel right now, but Israel as a nation can be worked with in the future, and they want to keep that door open. And remember, they were doing the exact same thing with Saudi Arabia. Even though Saudi Arabia was backing extremists that were killing Russians in Syria, Russia continued to work with Saudi Arabia because they're realists. They think long-term, and they think for what is in the best interests long-term for themselves, their people, peace and stability, because that equals prosperity for themselves and for everyone around them. If they were emotional and impulsive for revenge, they would have destroyed all of this. This would be a much bigger problem. We would be nowhere close to multipolarism prevailing. Yes, Scott.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say that for all the people in the chat, I know that I'm never going to convince anybody of anything, and that's fine. You all have your opinions, and you're not going to move, and I understand that. But I just want to remind everybody that there are evil politicians. There are people that do evil things. But for the most part, when you get down to the individual and the family level, all of these people are just born in this place out of circumstance. And, at the end of the day, nobody wants to die for any of this. This is not, I think that I don't want to speak for Brian here, but for me personally, and I believe for Brian, what we would like to see is nobody dying. We would like to see peace in this region, right? That's the crazy thing is everybody's just people. And when you're talking about Russians and Ukrainians, there are some Nazis, right? There are these individuals. There is an ideology that is wrong in Ukraine. That ideology also exists in Russia. There are Nazis in Russia, right? Not so much at the government and in the military, but they exist. There's Nazis in the United States. There's Nazis everywhere, right? It's an ideology, but that is not the bulk of people, right? Most of the people dying in Ukraine on both sides, Russian and Ukrainian, are just normal people. And most of the people in Israel and in Palestine that are dying are just normal people. And that is, I think that's something that people have to get their mind around, and not make your enemy into this, your perceived enemy into this awful monster, that boogeyman that, you know, you can hate.
That has to be annihilated. There is no compromise. They have to be annihilated. And everyone in Israel has to be annihilated. And just think about that. That's
or everybody in Palestine has to be annihilated.
Yeah.
It goes both ways.
Unrealistic. It's unrealistic. It's not.
Try not to think like that, because that, I mean, if you think like that, you are part of the evil, right? That you're subscribing to this idea that a whole group of people need to go away, and that's just like that. That is part of it. And the only group of people that really need to go away are the Americans. Honestly, the Americans need to leave the region. That's the only thing that needs to happen.
Yeah. And one last thing, because I also see a lot of people talking about Zionism, which is a real thing, and it is a toxic ideology. But this is the thing. People who are hyper-focused on the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, they have tunnel vision, and they don't see that you have the exact same type of ideologies encouraged by the U.S. in Ukraine. You have the exact same type of ideologies being encouraged. Even here in Asia, you have the West encouraging some of the most toxic ideologies, the most violent, the most despicable types of ideas. And they do that to, again, create division, create animosity, create chaos that they can then use to shape the region. It's something that empire has done all throughout history. It does it currently under the U.S., and they do it in all places, not just Zionism is not special. It is not unique. It is just one of many divide and conquer tools that empire has and is still using. So we'll continue. We're past an hour. I wanted to kind of keep it to an hour, unless there's another issue you want to address.
No, I just wanted to say I love this chat. This chat is it's so funny to watch this chat while we're talking here, and I just look over and I see, like, you know, I'll see somebody like, yeah, Scott, that's right. And then I'll see somebody like, Scott is a dreamer. It's like, Scott is 100% wrong. Brian, you're wrong. And it's just so funny to watch, just back and forth.
Yeah, and you know, some of these, I recognize a lot of these names, and some of these people are very reasonable on other issues. But then, and I totally understand it. People have their causes, and they get super invested in it, and it impairs their reason.
Sometimes I feel like a sociopath when I'm doing my analysis, and I understand how people can't always get into that mindset. It can be super cold and calculated, right? When you're talking about, I mean, when we're talking about Ukraine, it's like, well, the Ukrainians need to just send more men in to die to get this done. And it's like, that is like the coldest thing you could say, you know? But that's sometimes how you have to think when you're doing analysis. So.
Yeah. Well, why don't you tell people, Scott, where they can find and follow your work again? All of this information will be in the video description.
Yeah. So if you guys want to follow me on Telegram and Twitter, that's where you can see my constant posting. That's where you can get the most accurate and timely updates on the Ukraine conflict. That's my focus. I will cover other major events, like the stuff that happened no, I am not a Jew. Somebody just asked if I'm a Jew. I am of no religion. So yeah, that's where I sit. So no, you can follow me there on Telegram and Twitter. That's where I post all the time. And then my YouTube, Kalibrated with Scott, I post there frequently. I'm going to start posting there more frequently. My schedule is finally opening up, so I'm going to be able to do more podcasts. And that's the easiest way you guys can support me. Yeah. Thank you, Brian, for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yes. Thank you for coming on, especially so early in the morning. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in live. Well, maybe we'll have more to say about Israel and Palestine if the conflict continues to escalate. We'll probably focus on that again in the near future. And until next time, bye for now.
Bye, guys.